My name is Rebecca Harper, but everyone calls me Becky. I'm 37 years old, and I've spent the last 5 years of my life as a travel blogger, exploring forgotten trails, hidden spots, and spooky legends across the Midwest. This happened in October 2021, when I decided to camp alone in Morgan Monroe State Forest in Indiana. If you've never heard of the place, it's beautiful. Thick woods, crumbling stone walls from old farms, and trails that feel like they lead you straight into the past. But it's also got a darker side. Locals call it the most haunted forest in the state. People whisper about strange sounds, ghost lights, and something they call the Whistler. It's said that if you hear a whistle at night, you should never follow it, or you'll end up like the others who went missing in those woods. I didn't believe in any of it. That's why I went. I rolled into the forest in my little refurbished RV, a turquoise 78 Sunline I named Penny, just before sunset. I parked in a clearing near the Fire Tower Trail, a spot I'd scouted online. The air was cool, and a mist was already creeping through the trees. Perfect ambiance for the spooky blog post I had planned. I spent an hour setting up. Camera, check. Tripod, check. Voice recorder? Check. Everything was ready. I filmed a short intro for my vlog, explaining the legend of the Whistler and laughing about how I was going to debunk it. "This is Becky Harper," I said, pointing the camera at myself, "here to prove that not every creepy campfire story has teeth. Let's see if Morgan Monroe lives up to its reputation." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit a small fire outside the RV and settled in. I'd planned to start exploring after dark, but the forest had other ideas. It started around 9 p.m. I was editing photos by the fire when I heard it. A soft, lilting whistle, drifting through the trees. It was faint, like someone far away, but clear enough to make me pause. At first, I thought it was another camper. Maybe someone hiking the trail. But then I remembered the warnings. Never follow the whistle. I laughed to myself. It was probably just the wind. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, curiosity gnawing at me. There was no one there. The whistle came again, closer this time. It was melodic, almost like a lullaby, and it sent a shiver down my spine. For the first time that night I felt uneasy. I decided to call it a night, retreating to the safety of the RV. But as I was locking the door, I heard footsteps circling the vehicle. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the fallen leaves. "Hello?" I called out, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. The firelight cast long shadows through the trees, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure, a man, standing just out of reach, but when I focused on the spot, there was no one there. I shook my head. My imagination was running wild. I climbed into the RV and locked the door behind me. To distract myself, I reviewed the pictures I'd taken earlier. They were mostly shots of the trail and the crumbling stone walls nearby. But as I scrolled through, I noticed something odd. In one of the photos, taken near the fire tower, there was a figure in the background. It was blurry, almost transparent, but definitely human-shaped. It hadn't been there when I snapped the picture. My stomach tightened. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was a tree. Or maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The next morning, I woke to find the forest blanketed in a thick fog. Visibility was terrible, but I was determined to explore. I grabbed my camera, flashlight, and a water bottle and set off toward the Fire Tower Trail. The fog made everything feel off. Trees I'd passed the day before now looked unfamiliar, their branches twisting like skeletal arms. The trail seemed narrower, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About halfway up the trail, the whistle returned. It was louder now, echoing through the woods. The fire tower trail led to an old metal tower, rusted and abandoned, standing like a sentinel in the middle of the forest. It creaked in the wind, and the steps were slick with moss and rain. I climbed up anyway, hoping to get a better view of the foggy woods below. From the top, the whistle sounded again. It was coming from the base of the tower. My heart pounded as I peered down. There, in the swirling mist, was a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like tattered old-fashioned clothes. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring up at me. "Hey!" I shouted. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he started whistling again, the same haunting tune. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I scrambled down the ladder as fast as I could, nearly slipping on the wet metal. When I reached the ground, the figure was gone. But the whistle wasn't. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, growing louder and more insistent. I turned in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it was useless. The fog made the woods feel endless, like I'd stepped into another world. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs as I stumbled down the trail, trying to find my way back to the RV. But the path twisted in ways it hadn't before, leading me deeper into the forest. The whistle followed me, growing closer with every step. Eventually, I tripped over a root and fell hard, scraping my palms on the rocky ground. When I looked up, the figure was standing over me. He was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow, and his mouth twisted into an unnatural smile as he whistled that same haunting tune. I tried to crawl away, but my body felt heavy, like the air itself was holding me down. The figure leaned closer, his face inches from mine. His breath smelled like ash and decay. Desperation took over. I fumbled in my pack and pulled out a handful of iron nails. I'd read somewhere that ghosts and spirits couldn't stand iron. I threw them at him, and the effect was immediate. The figure shrieked, his form flickering like a dying flame before dissolving into the mist. The pressure lifted, and I could move again. I didn't waste a second. I ran until I found the clearing where I'd parked the RV. I didn't stop to pack. I jumped into Penny, turned the key, and peeled out of there as fast as the old engine would let me. As I drove away, the fog thinned, and the forest began to look normal again. But just as I reached the edge of the woods, I heard it one last time. The whistle. I didn't look back. When I got home, I reviewed the footage I'd captured. Most of it was unusable, blurry, overexposed, or mysteriously corrupted. But one clip stood out. It was a recording I didn't remember taking, showing the fire tower from below. In the corner of the frame, barely visible through the mist, was the figure. I posted my story anyway. It went viral, of course. People argued over the video, calling it fake, a publicity stunt, whatever. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never go back to Morgan Monroe. My name is Jack Mason, and I'm 64 years old. This happened in the fall of 2022, just after I retired as a forest ranger. I had spent over 30 years in the wilderness, patrolling trails, chasing off bears, and sometimes even helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. You'd think a man like me would have no reason to be afraid of the woods, but I'm telling you, what I experienced in the Hoosier National Forest will haunt me for the rest of my days. I had just bought an old RV, a 1988 Winnebago. Nothing fancy, but it ran well enough. The plan was simple. Park it somewhere secluded, spend a few days camping, and finally get the peace I had been craving. My wife, Catherine, used to love trips like this. She passed 5 years ago in a hiking accident, one I couldn't prevent, and I still carry the guilt of it. I thought this trip might help me reconnect with her memory and maybe even forgive myself. I chose the Sycamore Trail in Hoosier National Forest. It's not as busy as some of the other spots, and I knew the land like the back of my hand. The locals had always told stories about the area, warnings to stay away from certain trails, whispers of things that didn't belong in those woods. But I'd always chalked it up to superstition. After all, the forest can play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. The first day went smoothly enough. I parked the RV in a small clearing just off the trailhead. It was a gorgeous spot, the kind of place Catherine would have loved. There was a crisp chill in the air, and the trees were ablaze with autumn colors. I set up camp, got a fire going, and cooked myself a simple meal of canned chili. The only problem was my equipment. My old flashlight was flickering, and my camp stove gave me trouble lighting up. Nothing major, just annoyances. Or so I thought. That night, as I sat by the fire, I started to feel off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. The woods were quieter than they should have been. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves. Just dead silence. Then, just as I was about to head inside the RV, I heard something. "Jack!" It was faint but unmistakable. Someone was calling my name. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. The voice sounded familiar, too familiar. It sounded like Catherine. "Jack, help me." The voice was coming from deep in the woods beyond the reach of my firelight. My heart was racing. I told myself it couldn't be her, it couldn't. But it sounded so real, so desperate. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the darkness. I didn't go far. My flashlight barely worked, and the further I moved from the fire, the darker and colder it got. That's when I saw them. Tracks in the mud. They were strange, like a mix between human footprints and animal paw prints, as if someone had been walking barefoot but with claws. They led in a wide circle around my RV before disappearing into the woods. I stood there, staring at the tracks, trying to make sense of them. That's when I heard the voice again, closer this time. "Jack, please, it hurts." It was Catherine, or at least it sounded like her. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to sound tough. The forest didn't answer. I backed away slowly, my flashlight flickering, and retreated to the safety of the RV. Locking the door behind me, I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was a bird mimicking her voice. Maybe I was hearing things. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, I tried to shake it off. I spent the morning exploring the trail, hoping a good hike would clear my head. The woods were still unnervingly quiet, but nothing unusual happened. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. That's when the rain started. Light at first, then heavy. I sprained my ankle, slipping on the wet ground while fetching firewood, cursing under my breath as I hobbled back to the RV. The storm made the forest even darker, and the flickering flashlight wasn't much help. That night, I heard scratching. It started faint, like branches brushing against the RV, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Something, or someone, was outside. I peered through the window, but all I saw was darkness. Then came the knocking. 3 sharp knocks on the side of the RV, followed by silence. "Who's there?" I yelled, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed my hunting rifle and edged toward the door. My heart pounded as I threw it open, aiming into the night. But there was nothing there. Nothing except the faintest outline of a figure in the trees, tall and impossibly thin. The next morning, I decided to leave. I'd had enough. But when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked under the hood only to find deep scratches gouged into the metal, like claw marks. My chest tightened. I was trapped. Desperation took over. I grabbed my gear and decided to hike out, sprained ankle or not. But as I started down the trail, the forest seemed different. The trees felt closer, the shadows darker. The air was thick, oppressive, and every step I took felt like I was being watched. Then I saw it. It was standing in the middle of the trail, about 50 yards ahead. At first, it looked human, long limbs, pale skin. But as I stepped closer, its head jerked unnaturally, and its body twisted, bending in ways no human body should. It turned toward me, and I swear it smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many. "Jack," it said, in Catherine's voice. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my rifle. It started walking toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. I ran. Pain shot through my ankle, but I didn't care. I ran as fast as I could, the creature's laughter echoing behind me. When I reached the old fire tower, I climbed up, hoping the height would give me an advantage. The creature followed. It circled the base of the tower, its voice shifting between Catherine's pleas and a low, guttural growl. "Jack, don't leave me," it whispered, its voice distorted and mocking. I remembered the stories, the ones I used to laugh at. Skinwalkers, creatures that could mimic voices, take on forms, and lure people to their deaths. The locals had always said salt could repel them. It was worth a shot. I dug into my pack and poured a ring of salt around the platform, gripping my rifle tightly. The creature climbed halfway up the tower, but as it neared the salt, it recoiled, letting out an ear-piercing shriek. It stared at me for a long moment, its dark eyes burning with rage, before it slithered back down the ladder and disappeared into the woods. When the sun rose, I climbed down the tower, my legs trembling. The forest felt lighter, less oppressive, but the tracks in the mud told me the creature was still out there. I hobbled back to the RV, praying the engine would start this time. It did. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it, standing at the edge of the forest. It didn't follow me, but I knew it was watching. I haven't been back to the Hoosier National Forest since. I sold the RV, gave up camping, and tried to move on. But at night, I still hear Catherine's voice calling to me from the darkness. And I'll never forget those eyes. My name is Ryan Clark. I'm 38 years old, and this happened last October near Devil's Hollow Road in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm a wildlife photographer and admittedly a skeptic. I've spent years exploring remote locations, capturing nature's raw beauty, and debunking myths of the paranormal along the way. Ghost stories, curses, strange creatures, they've all been entertaining tales, nothing more. That's what I thought, at least. I was wrong. I just finalized my divorce a few weeks before and needed to clear my head. The open road seemed like the perfect escape, and my RV had everything I needed to stay off the grid. While searching for a new project, I stumbled upon Devil's Hollow, a stretch of road surrounded by dense woods and an unsettling history. Supposedly, it was cursed by a witch named Evelyn Black, who was killed there in the 1800s after being blamed for several disappearances. The legend said her spirit still haunted the area, along with the lost ones, people who had vanished after trespassing near her old cabin. It was exactly the kind of story I wanted to explore and prove wrong. I'd spend a couple of days photographing the area, maybe even find the ruins of Evelyn's cabin, and move on with a good story for my portfolio. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my RV near a small clearing off the road. The air was damp, and the forest seemed unusually dark for the time of day. As I set up my camera gear, I noticed something odd about the trees. Their trunks twisted unnaturally, as if they were leaning toward me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the hair on my neck stand up. I started hiking just before dusk, following what looked like an old trail through the woods. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the dirt. About a mile in, I found it. A crumbled stone foundation, overgrown with moss and vines. This had to be Evelyn Black's cabin. I snapped a few photos, but my camera kept malfunctioning. Every shot came out blurry, as if the lens was fogged, even though it wasn't. Annoyed, I packed up and made a mental note to come back in the morning with better light. As I turned to leave, I caught a faint whiff of smoke. It wasn't the sharp scent of burning wood. It was something sweeter, like incense. I looked around, but there was no sign of fire. The smell lingered all the way back to my RV. That night, the knocking started. I was sitting at the small table in the RV, reviewing my notes, when I heard it. A soft, deliberate knock on the window behind me. I froze. The campground was supposed to be deserted, and I hadn't seen a single car or hiker since I arrived. Slowly, I turned and peeked out the curtain. Nothing. Just the dark forest, the shadows of trees swaying in the faint moonlight. Probably just a branch, I muttered, though I wasn't convinced. The knocking came again, this time on the side door. I grabbed a flashlight and opened it, shining the beam into the woods. Still nothing, but as I stepped back inside, I noticed them. Wet handprints on the windows. Small, child-sized handprints smeared in the condensation. My stomach turned. There were no kids out here. The next morning, I returned to the ruins of the cabin, determined to get better shots. As I approached, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed darker than before, even under the mid-morning sun. I heard whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound was too distinct. Murmured voices just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but they were speaking my name. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. "Is someone there?" No response. Just the whispers, growing fainter, as if they were retreating deeper into the woods. At the edge of the foundation, I found something new. A circle of blackened stones charred as if they'd been part of a fire. I crouched down, running my hand over one of the stones. It was warm. A twig snapped behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. No one, except for a shadowy figure standing just inside the tree line. It was a woman, tall and thin, draped in black. Her face was hidden by a veil, and her posture was unnaturally stiff, as though she were being held up by invisible strings. "Evelyn?" I whispered, though I didn't believe it. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I blinked, and she was gone. I should have left then. Any sane person would have, but I was too stubborn, too determined to prove there was a logical explanation. That night, the knocking returned, louder, more insistent. It was on all sides of the RV now, coming from the windows, the roof, the door. I grabbed my flashlight and shouted, "Who's out there?" The knocking stopped, replaced by laughter. High-pitched, childlike laughter echoing from every direction. My blood ran cold. I slammed the flashlight into the table, cracking the lens, and grabbed my camera instead. The screen flickered, but it worked long enough for me to capture a single photo through the windshield. The flash illuminated the woods for a split second, and I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the trees. They were pale, almost translucent, their faces blurred like an out-of-focus image. The lost ones. The laughter grew louder, blending into whispers that filled the air like a swarm of insects. I clutched the camera to my chest and bolted for the driver's seat, starting the RV. As I turned the key, the headlights illuminated the road ahead. Evelyn was standing there, directly in front of me. Her veil was gone, revealing a hollow, eyeless face. her mouth twisted into a terrible grin. The engine sputtered, refusing to start. "Come to me," she whispered, though her lips didn't move. The lost ones swarmed closer, their forms flickering like candle flames. They pressed their hands against the RV, their touch leaving streaks of frost on the glass. Desperate, I grabbed my camera. The broken lens buzzed with static as if it were alive. Without thinking, I hurled it out the window toward the swamp on the side of the road. The second it hit the water, Evelyn let out a blood-curdling scream. The air around me seemed to collapse, rushing toward the swamp like a vacuum. The figures disappeared, and the RV roared to life. I didn't look back. The next morning, I parked at a rest stop miles away, trying to convince myself it was over. But when I stepped outside, I saw something waiting for me on the RV's step. My camera bag. Inside was the photo I'd taken, the one with the lost ones. But this time there was something new, Evelyn's face reflected in the shadows. She was smiling. My name is Claire Thompson. I'm 30 years old, and this happened last November in Morgan Monroe State Forest, Indiana. I'm a freelance journalist and an aspiring novelist, obsessed with folklore and urban legends. It's how I make a living, chasing stories, uncovering truths buried under years of superstition. That's why I decided to take my RV out for a solo trip to Step Cemetery. The cemetery's legend was well known to locals. A grieving mother cursed the land after losing her child, and now people claim to see shadowy figures and hear ghostly laughter. It sounded perfect for the book I was writing about haunted locations in the Midwest. I thought I'd spend a couple of nights in the area, get some atmospheric inspiration, maybe even debunk the myths. I was so wrong. The first sign that something was off happened as soon as I pulled into the forest. I parked my RV at one of the campsites, miles from the nearest trailhead. The late autumn air was crisp, and the forest was mostly silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves. It felt peaceful but heavy, like the forest was watching me. I shook off the feeling and decided to check out the cemetery before dark. It wasn't far, just a short hike through the woods. Step Cemetery was small, just a few crumbling headstones nestled among the trees. Some of the graves were so old the inscriptions had worn away completely. A large tree stood at the center, its gnarled branches spreading like twisted fingers across the sky. At the base of the tree, someone had left toys: a plastic doll, a tiny truck, and a stuffed bear missing one eye. I snapped a few photos and jotted down notes in my journal. Grieving mother, ghost stories, I muttered to myself. Local legend, probably exaggerated. The skeptic in me brushed it off, but a part of me couldn't deny the eerie vibe. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were small, like those of a child, and they circled around the tree. They were fresh. When I got back to my RV, it was just after sunset. The first thing I noticed was the knocking, a faint tapping on the driver's side window. I froze. The campground was supposed to be deserted, and I hadn't seen anyone else since I arrived. Slowly, I moved toward the window and peeked out. Nothing, just the shadows of trees swaying in the moonlight. I told myself it was probably a branch, even though there were no trees close enough to hit the RV. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I locked the doors, closed all the curtains, and settled in for the night. As I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something on the RV door. Tiny handprints smeared into the dust. They hadn't been there before. I laughed nervously. "Great, local kids playing pranks," I muttered. But deep down, I knew better. The forest had been empty. No one had followed me here. The next morning, I decided to push through my fear and return to the cemetery. This time, I brought my camera and a voice recorder, hoping to catch something for my book. or at least prove to myself that nothing supernatural was happening. The cemetery was colder than the rest of the forest, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. I started taking pictures of the headstones, making sure to get wide angles of the tree and the toys beneath it. As I walked around, the air seemed to shift. It became heavier. That's the only way I can describe it. Then I heard it. Faint sobbing, like a woman crying in the distance. My heart started pounding. I scanned the trees, but no one was there. I hit record on my voice recorder and said, "Is someone there?" The sobbing stopped, and then I saw her. At the far end of the cemetery, a woman stood in the shadows, dressed in black from head to toe. A veil covered her face, and her figure was so still she almost didn't look real. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I stepped closer, but as soon as I did, she disappeared. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone. At the spot where she had been standing, I found a child's shoe. It was old, the leather cracked and worn. I didn't take it, I was too afraid to touch it. But I took a picture before leaving the cemetery as quickly as I could. That night, the knocking came back, louder this time. It wasn't just on the windows, it was on the roof. A steady, deliberate thud, thud, thud that made my stomach churn. "Who's there?" I shouted, grabbing a flashlight. The sound stopped. I opened the door and shone the light outside. The ground was covered in frost, and there were no footprints leading to the RV. But the handprints were back. More of them this time, covering every window. I slammed the door shut and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to calm my racing heart. Then I heard it, the laughter of children. It wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the RV. My blood ran cold. I looked around, but there was nothing. Just shadows and the faint sound of creaking wood, like a rocking chair swaying back and forth. But there was no rocking chair in the RV. I grabbed my voice recorder and hit play, hoping to distract myself. At first, all I heard was static, but then a voice came through, my own voice from earlier in the cemetery saying, "Is someone there?" The recorder played back what I hadn't heard in real time. A woman's voice, low and broken, answered, "Where is my child?" The next morning, I went straight to the park office and found Jake, the ranger I'd spoken to briefly when I arrived. He looked surprised to see me. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Funny you should say that," I replied, forcing a laugh. Then I told him everything. The handprints, the knocking, the laughter, the woman in black. Jake's face paled. "You went to Step Cemetery, didn't you?" I nodded. "You didn't warn me it was that haunted." Jake sighed and leaned against the counter. "I didn't want to scare you off. But yeah, there's a lot of stories about that place. Most of them trace back to a woman named Marie Elder. She lost her child to illness back in the 1800s and spent the rest of her life grieving. When she died, people say she cursed the land, claiming no mother would ever find peace there. Some folks think the ghostly children are spirits trapped by her curse." "That's comforting," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Jake shook his head. "If I were you, I'd leave. Whatever's out there, it's best not to mess with it." I should have listened, but I was stubborn. I told myself I couldn't just leave without finishing what I started. That night, I stayed in the RV, clutching my recorder like a talisman. Around midnight, I heard it again. The sound of a baby crying. It was faint at first, then louder, echoing through the forest. I tried to ignore it, but the sound was hypnotic, pulling me toward the cemetery. Before I knew it, I was standing under the gnarled tree, surrounded by graves. The crying stopped, and the air grew deathly still. Then I saw them. The children. Pale, translucent figures darting between the headstones. their laughter high-pitched and unnatural. Their faces were blurred, as if they weren't fully formed. They circled me, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. "Stay and play with us. Stay." I turned to run, but there she was, the woman in black. Her veil fluttered in the cold wind, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. "Where is my child?" she demanded, her voice echoing like a thunderclap. "I don't know," I cried, backing away. She raised her hand, and I felt an invisible force pull me toward her, as if the ground itself was trying to swallow me. Desperate, I fumbled for my voice recorder and hit play. The sound of her own voice echoed back to her. "Where is my child?" The ghost froze, her form flickering like a dying flame. The children screamed and vanished into the shadows, and the woman in black dissolved into a cloud of mist. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to my RV, locked the doors, and drove out of the forest without looking back. I never finished that book. The voice recorder still sits in a drawer at home, untouched. Sometimes I think about listening to it, just to see if I missed something. But then I remember the handprints on my windows, the laughter inside the RV, and the hollow eyes of the woman in black. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Jenna Carter. I'm 24 years old, and this happened to me last November. It started as a camping trip in Brown County State Park, Indiana. Just a fun, challenging escape with friends. But what I experienced out there wasn't just nature. Something ancient and evil stalked us through that forest, and I barely made it out alive. It was Mason's idea. He was the ringleader in our group of 3. Confident, outdoorsy, and just reckless enough to convince us this trip was a good idea. He was 26, with that charming, cocky smile that somehow made me trust him, even when I shouldn't. Then there was Ben, Mason's best friend since childhood. He was 25, and the opposite of Mason, reserved, practical, and constantly trying to keep us from getting into trouble. Me? I was just there for the adventure. I'd been feeling stuck lately, living the same routine in Indianapolis, and Mason's enthusiasm made me want to break out of my comfort zone. So when he suggested we tackle an unofficial trail he'd found on some wilderness forum, I thought, why not? We packed light. Mason insisted we didn't need much for a 3-day trip. Looking back, that was mistake number 1. The first day went fine. We parked at the trailhead and hiked deeper into the park than I'd ever been. The colors of the late autumn forest were stunning, rich reds and golds under a steel gray sky. Mason led the way with his usual bravado, joking about how we didn't even need a map because he had the route all figured out. Ben kept muttering about how we should at least double-check our bearings, but Mason brushed him off. By the time we reached our first campsite, we were tired but in good spirits. We set up a small fire, ate some protein bars, and talked about everything and nothing under the canopy of stars. It was peaceful until the forest went silent. I didn't notice it at first, but Ben did. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" Mason replied, poking at the fire. "Nothing," Ben said. "No crickets, no owls, nothing." Now that he mentioned it, the silence felt wrong. It pressed down on us like a weight, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Mason shrugged it off, saying it was probably the cold weather. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. The second day was harder. The hidden path Mason had raved about turned out to be more of a rough deer trail, barely visible under the thick leaves. My legs ached from climbing over fallen trees and trudging through uneven ground. To make matters worse, Ben's compass stopped working. He swore it had been fine yesterday, but now the needle spun uselessly, as if the forest itself was messing with us. Around midday, we found something strange. Deep claw marks scored the bark of a massive oak tree. They were too high up to be from a bear, if there were even bears in this part of Indiana. Mason joked about Bigfoot, but Ben's face darkened. "This isn't right," Ben said. "We should turn back." "Turn back? Come on, man, we're fine," Mason said. "Don't wimp out now." Ben shot me a look that said, "Can you believe this guy?" I wanted to agree with him, but I didn't want to be the one to back down first. So we kept going. That night, the hunger started. Mason devoured most of our food. He claimed he hadn't eaten enough earlier and needed the energy, but the way he tore through the rations was unsettling. His hands shook as he unwrapped granola bars, and his eyes had this wild, hollow look. "You okay, Mason?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just starving," he muttered, not meeting my gaze. "Don't worry about it." Ben pulled me aside while Mason stomped off to gather more firewood. "Something's wrong with him," Ben whispered. "He's acting off." "I know," I said. "But what are we supposed to do? Drag him back to the car?" Ben didn't answer. He just stared into the dark woods, his jaw tight. Later that night, I heard whispering. I'd stepped away from the campfire to use the bathroom. The air was freezing, my breath puffing white in front of me. That's when I heard it. A low, raspy murmur just beyond the tree line. "Ben? Mason?" I called, my voice shaking. There was no answer, only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot, too far away to be either of them. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding. "What's wrong?" Mason asked when he saw me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. "Someone's out there," I said, trying to catch my breath. "I heard them." "It's probably just the wind," Mason said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Ben pulled out the flimsy flashlight Jenna had packed, the beam flickering weakly as he scanned the surrounding trees. "We need to leave first thing in the morning," he said. Morning didn't come fast enough. I woke up to the sound of Mason vomiting behind the tent. When I went to check on him, I saw blood mixed in with the bile. "You're sick," I said, panic rising in my chest. "We have to get you out of here." "No," Mason rasped, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Ben snapped. "You look like death, and now we're out of food thanks to you." Mason glared at him, his teeth bared. For a moment, I thought he was going to lunge at Ben, but then he stumbled back, clutching his stomach. "Let's just keep moving," he said through gritted teeth. We packed up and started hiking, but Mason was slower now, his breath labored. The trail seemed to twist in on itself, leading us deeper into the forest instead of out. The claw marks appeared more frequently, gouged into the trees like some kind of territorial warning. And then we found the carcass. It was a deer, or at least what was left of one. Its ribs jutted out like spears, the flesh stripped away as if something had gnawed on it. The smell was overwhelming, rotting meat and coppery blood. Mason stared at it for a long time, his eyes wide and unblinking. "We need to keep moving," Ben said, grabbing my arm. "Now." That night, Mason disappeared. Ben and I woke up to find his sleeping bag empty, his boots gone. "We have to find him," I said. But Ben shook his head. "He's gone, Jenna. We can't save him." "We can't just leave him out there," I yelled. Ben sighed, his face lined with exhaustion. "Fine, but if we don't find him by sunset, we're heading back." We followed a faint trail of footprints, half expecting to find Mason sitting by a tree laughing about some stupid prank. Instead, we found him crouched over another deer carcass, his face smeared with blood. "Mason?" I called out softly. He turned to look at us, and my stomach dropped. His eyes were sunken, his skin stretched taut over his cheekbones. His lips pulled back in a grotesque smile, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too jagged. "The hunger," he whispered. "It's inside me." Ben grabbed my hand, pulling me back. "Run," he said. We ran, crashing through the underbrush, but Mason, or whatever he'd become, was fast. I could hear him behind us, his ragged breathing growing louder, closer. "Go!" Ben shouted, shoving me forward. "I'll hold him off." "No!" I screamed. But Ben didn't stop. He turned to face Mason, wielding a large branch like a spear. I didn't see what happened next. I just kept running, tears streaming down my face as I heard Ben's screams echoing through the trees. I stumbled out of the forest at dawn, bloodied and half frozen. Park rangers found me near the trailhead and took me to a hospital. I told them everything, but they didn't believe me. They said Mason and Ben probably got lost and that I was lucky to make it out alive. But I know the truth. Somewhere in those woods, the Wendigo still roams, hungry and waiting for its next victim. My name is Erica Monroe, and I'm 29 years old. I'm a wildlife biologist and an avid camper. I've always preferred the solitude of the woods to the chaos of city life. But what happened to me last October in Shade State Park changed the way I look at the wilderness forever. I wasn't just alone out there. I was being hunted. I'd just gone through a messy breakup and needed an escape. Shade State Park seemed like the perfect place to clear my head and refocus on my work. I had an article deadline looming about the biodiversity in Indiana's state parks, and I figured a few nights in the woods would give me the peace I needed to write. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, parking my RV in one of the more secluded campsites near the edge of the park. The spot was surrounded by tall trees, their leaves starting to turn shades of orange and gold. A narrow ravine cut through the area, and the soft gurgle of a distant creek was the only sound. As I set up my gear, I realized I'd forgotten to pack extra batteries for my flashlight. Amateur mistake, I muttered to myself. Still, I shrugged it off, figuring my phone's light would suffice if needed. I was more concerned about the thick fog rolling in. It clung to the ground, making the woods feel unnervingly still. That night, as I sat by the fire, I heard it for the first time. Faint crying, drifting through the trees. It sounded like a child, soft and pitiful. I froze, listening, my heart pounding. It wasn't unusual to hear strange noises in the woods, but this was different. The sound tugged at something deep inside me, like an instinct I couldn't ignore. "Hello?" I called, standing and shining my phone's light into the trees. The crying stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence behind. My gut told me to stay put, but I couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone might need help. Grabbing my phone and a jacket, I ventured a few steps into the woods. "Is someone there?" I called again, my voice trembling. No answer, just the rustling of leaves as a light breeze picked up. After a few minutes of searching, I gave up and headed back to the RV, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. The next morning, I met Ranger Neil. He was making his rounds and stopped by my campsite to chat. He was in his 40s, with a weathered face and a calm demeanor. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "You out here all alone?" "Yeah," I replied, pouring myself a cup of coffee. "I'm a biologist, doing some research." "Ah, well, be careful," he said, glancing at the fog still clinging to the trees. "Shades has its quirks. Folks around here like to tell stories about the crying woods." I raised an eyebrow. "The crying woods?" "Old legend," he said, leaning on his truck. "Back in the 30s, a little girl went missing out here. Family never found her. Some say you can still hear her crying, trying to lead people into the woods. Thing is, those who follow the sound don't always come back." I laughed nervously. "That's unsettling." Neil gave me a long, serious look. "Just stay on the trails, all right?" I nodded, but his words stuck with me. That day, I decided to explore a few trails and take notes for my article. The woods were beautiful in the daylight, full of vibrant colors and the earthy smell of fallen leaves. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. About an hour into my hike, I noticed footprints on the trail. They were small, like a child's, and barefoot. I stopped, frowning. What kind of parent lets their kid wander around here without shoes? The prints veered off the trail, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I crouched down to take a closer look. The edges of the prints were fresh, the soil still slightly damp. A chill ran down my spine. I stood quickly, deciding it was time to head back to the RV. That night, the crying returned. It started softly, just beyond the edge of the campsite. This time, it didn't stop when I called out. Instead, it grew louder, more desperate. "Help me," a small voice whimpered. My heart raced as I peered out the RV window. In the dim firelight, I saw her. A girl, no older than 8, standing at the edge of the trees. She was barefoot, wearing a dirty white dress, her hair tangled and wild. She was crying, her shoulders shaking. "Hey," I called, grabbing my jacket. "Are you okay?" The girl looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. Her face was pale, her cheeks streaked with tears. But her eyes, they were hollow, dark as the void. Before I could react, she turned and ran into the woods. "Wait!" I shouted, chasing after her. The fog swallowed me as I stumbled through the trees, calling for the girl. The crying grew fainter, pulling me deeper and deeper into the woods. My phone's light barely cut through the haze, and the trees seemed to close in around me. Finally, I stopped, gasping for breath. The crying had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. I turned in a slow circle, realizing I had no idea where I was. My stomach sank. Then I saw it. A small, crumbling cabin hidden among the trees. The door hung crookedly on its hinges and the windows were broken. I approached cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity won out. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light as I stepped over broken furniture and shattered glass. On a table in the corner, I found a stack of old newspapers, yellowed with age. My breath caught as I read the headline, "Local Girl Missing in Shades State Park." The date was from 1937. Beneath the article was a photograph of the girl. It was her, the same girl I'd seen in the woods. As I skimmed the article, a detail jumped out at me. The girl had been suspected of pushing her younger brother into a ravine shortly before her disappearance. She'd claimed it was an accident, but witnesses reported hearing the siblings arguing moments before the tragedy. A sudden sound made me whirl around. The crying had returned, louder now, echoing through the cabin. My hands shook as I backed toward the door. When I stepped outside, the girl was there, standing at the edge of the ravine. Her crying stopped as she turned to face me, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Why did you leave me?" she whispered, her voice laced with anger. I didn't," I stammered, my throat dry. "I'm here to help." She took a step closer and her face twisted, her mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. Her eyes began to bleed, dark streaks running down her pale cheeks. "You'll stay with me," she said, her voice a distorted growl. The ground beneath me trembled, and I realized too late that I was standing at the edge of the ravine. Roots and dirt crumbled under my feet as the girl lunged at me, her hands clawing at my arms. I screamed, swinging my phone at her, the light catching her face. She recoiled, hissing like an animal, and vanished into the fog. My legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the forest floor, shaking uncontrollably. I don't know how I made it back to the RV. The walk was a blur, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. When I finally locked myself inside, I collapsed onto the bed, clutching my knees to my chest. As I drove out of the park the next morning, I heard the crying one last time, faint and distant. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the road, watching me leave. I haven't gone back to Shade State Park since, but sometimes late at night I hear a child crying outside my window, and I know she's still waiting for me. This story highlights the chilling lure of a malevolent spirit preying on empathy and curiosity to trap its victims. My name is Lucas Grayson, and I'm 27 years old. I'm a freelance journalist, and to be honest, a bit of a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. This happened in October of last year, when I decided to investigate Devil's Hollow, a place near Fort Wayne, Indiana, notorious for its ghost stories and rumors of occult rituals. What I experienced there still haunts me, and it's something I can't explain, at least not in the way I'd like to. I pulled my RV into Devil's Hollow just as the sun was beginning to set. The area lived up to its reputation. Fog rolled lazily across the ground, and the trees loomed over the narrow road like skeletal fingers. My plan was simple: spend a weekend camping in the area, collect notes and photos, and write a story debunking the local legends. I was sure the so-called haunted reputation was just small-town folklore blown out of proportion. The clearing I parked in was eerily quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of wildlife, just silence. Atmospheric, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the knot forming in my stomach. I set up camp quickly, unfolding a chair by the fire pit and arranging my camera gear on the picnic table. The plan was to explore the woods tomorrow and see if I could find any of the symbols or sites mentioned in my research. The trouble started almost immediately. As I settled in, the lights in the RV began to flicker. I checked the generator. It was running fine, but the interior lights continued to pulse erratically, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. Then, my camera refused to charge, despite being plugged into a fully functional power bank. "Great," I muttered. "Looks like this place is hard on electronics." The first real warning sign came the next morning. I woke early, brewed some coffee, and decided to take a short hike to familiarize myself with the area. I followed a faint trail that wound deeper into the woods, the fog clinging to my legs like damp sheets. About half a mile in, I noticed footprints on the path. Barefoot, human-like, but disturbingly large. The prints were fresh, leading away from the trail into the trees. I stopped, staring at them for a long moment. The rational part of my brain told me it was just someone messing around, maybe a local trying to scare campers. Still, the unease in my gut grew stronger. "It's just footprints," I said aloud, my voice sounding hollow in the stillness. I snapped a few pictures and moved on. Back at the campsite, I met Emily. She ran the small general store a few miles down the road and had stopped by to check on me, probably out of curiosity. She was older, maybe in her 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of caution. "You're camping out here alone?" she asked, leaning against her dusty pickup truck. "Yeah," I said, "just doing some research for a story." Emily frowned. "People don't usually stay here long. Devil's Hollow isn't welcoming to strangers." I laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "So I've heard, but I don't scare easy." "You should," she said flatly. "That place remembers everyone who stays too long. Be careful where you step." She hesitated before climbing back into her truck. "And don't go to the hollow itself. Some things are better left alone." Her words stayed with me long after she drove off. That night, things took a turn. As I sat by the fire reviewing my notes, I heard movement in the woods. At first, it sounded like branches snapping underfoot, but then it became something else entirely. Whispering. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, like multiple voices speaking at once. I froze, straining to make out the words, but they were too garbled to understand. "Hello," I called, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped instantly. I stood there for a long moment, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing. Finally, I shook it off and retreated into the RV, locking the door behind me. The flickering lights had returned, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I lay in bed, trying to ignore the feeling that I wasn't alone. At some point, I drifted off. I don't know what woke me, but when I opened my eyes, I saw something in the corner of the room. It was faint, almost like a trick of the light, but it looked like a human figure, just standing there watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I scrambled for the flashlight on my nightstand. When I flicked it on, the figure was gone. The next morning, I found symbols carved into the trees around my campsite. They were crude and angular, like something you'd see in a horror movie. Probably just vandals, I muttered, trying to convince myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Desperate for answers, I reviewed the audio recordings I'd made during the night. At first, it was just static, but then I heard it. The whispers. They were clearer now, overlapping voices that repeated the same phrase over and over. When I reversed the audio, the words became clear. "The land is bound. Blood must free it." A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to leave, but something about the message made me stay. I needed to understand what was happening. That evening, I ventured deeper into the woods, following a faint path that seemed to lead toward the heart of Devil's Hollow. The fog thickened as I walked, and the air grew colder, heavy with the smell of damp earth. About a mile in, I found a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak tree, its trunk scarred with the same symbols I'd seen earlier. The ground beneath it was blackened, as if burned. As I approached, I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was pushing against me. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from every direction. I turned to leave, but froze when I saw them. Shadowy figures emerging from the mist. They were humanoid but wrong, with glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The figures didn't move, but their eyes followed me. The pressure in my chest grew stronger, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. I ran back to the RV, my mind racing. What were those things, and what did the whispers mean? That night was the worst. The shadowy figures surrounded the RV, their glowing eyes peering through the windows. They pounded on the walls, shaking the entire vehicle. The lights flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move on their own. Desperate, I grabbed a knife and carved one of the symbols from the trees into my palm, hoping it would do something. Blood dripped onto the floor as I shouted into the darkness, "What do you want?" The pounding stopped. The shadowy figures retreated, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a voice, deep and guttural, coming from outside. The pact must be fulfilled. In a moment of desperation, I returned to the clearing with the oak tree. The shadowy figures were waiting for me, their red eyes glowing in the darkness. I knelt beneath the tree and pressed my bloody palm to its blackened roots. "Take it," I whispered. "Take what you want. Just let me go." The figures surrounded me, their whispers growing louder until it felt like my head would split. Then, as quickly as it started, everything went silent. The pressure in my chest lifted, and the figures dissolved into the mist. When I returned to the RV, the lights were steady, and the engine started on the first try. I left Devil's Hollow that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind, or that something had followed me. Even now, months later, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to find symbols drawn on my walls or hear faint whispers coming from the shadows. I don't know what I unleashed in Devil's Hollow, but one thing is certain. I'll never go back. This is the kind of place that stays with you. Even if you escape, it finds a way to remind you it's still watching. My name is Lila Carter, and I'm 32 years old. I'm a middle school teacher from Indiana. This happened in May of last year during a solo camping trip at Potato Creek State Park. At the time, I thought I just needed a weekend away, some time to decompress after the chaos of the school year. But what I found out there wasn't peace. It was something I don't think I'll ever truly escape. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, late enough that the sun was already starting to sink behind the trees. Potato Creek is beautiful, with wide-open lakes and dense forest trails that seem to stretch forever. I parked my old RV at a site near the water and set up my little camp. A folding chair by the fire pit, my journal and pens on the picnic table. It wasn't much, but it was all I needed. The first issue popped up almost immediately. The generator on my RV wouldn't stay on for more than a few minutes before sputtering out. I cursed under my breath. Without it, I wouldn't have power for lights or to charge my phone. I reminded myself I'd come here to unplug anyway and shrugged it off. As I was unpacking, I noticed something odd. A deer stood at the edge of the woods, staring directly at me. It wasn't unusual in itself, but the way it stood there, perfectly still like a statue, sent a ripple of unease through me. When I waved my arms to scare it off, it didn't flinch. It just turned its head slightly, as if trying to understand me, then disappeared into the trees. I tried not to think about it as I made dinner. Night fell quickly, bringing a heavy silence with it. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just stillness. It was unsettling. I sat by the fire staring into the flames, and that's when I heard it. Whistling. It was faint at first, just a few notes carried by the breeze. I assumed it was another camper, but when I strained my ears, I realized it wasn't coming from the nearby sites. It was coming from deep in the woods. I don't know why, but the sound unsettled me. I went inside the RV and locked the door. When I checked my phone, I saw that I had no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the area was. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were strange that night. I kept hearing someone whispering my name over and over. When I finally woke up, drenched in sweat, I realized the RV door was slightly ajar. My heart nearly stopped. I was certain I'd locked it before going to bed. The next morning, I decided to shake off the weirdness and go for a hike. The fresh air felt good, and I started to relax as I walked the trails. That's when I saw the footprints. They were barefoot, large, but with long, twisted toes, almost like claws. They weren't human, but they weren't animal either. They appeared out of nowhere in the dirt and led off the trail into the dense underbrush. I stood there staring at them, my gut telling me to turn back, but I shook it off. It's just some weird animal, I told myself. Probably a bear. When I got back to my campsite, I met Jaden. He was camping a few sites down and seemed about my age, mid-30s, with a friendly smile and a bit of a nosy streak. "You camping alone?" he asked, glancing at my RV. I nodded, and he raised an eyebrow. "You're braver than me. This place has a weird vibe, you know." I laughed nervously and tried to brush him off, but he kept talking. "You heard the stories about this area? The Skinwalker legend? I shook my head, even though the word sent a chill down my spine. I'd heard it before, somewhere, but I couldn't remember the details. It's an old Native American story, Jaden explained. They say it's a shapeshifter, a spirit that can take the form of anything it wants. People, animals. It mimics voices, tries to lure you into the woods. Once you see it, you're pretty much screwed. He grinned, like it was all a big joke, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Thanks for the bedtime story, I said dryly, trying to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the knot forming in my stomach. That night, I heard the whistling again, louder this time. It started faint, like the night before, but it grew closer and closer until it sounded like it was right outside the RV. Then it stopped, replaced by silence. I stayed perfectly still, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lila?" A voice called softly. My blood turned to ice. It was my voice. "Lila?" It said again. This time, with a strange rasping tone, I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a flashlight, and crept toward the window. My hands were shaking as I peeked outside. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed something standing just beyond the edge of the firelight. It looked like me, but wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its face twisted into a grotesque grin. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "No, no, no," I whispered, barely able to breathe. The thing outside started scratching at the RV door, slow and deliberate, the sound making my skin crawl. "Lila, let me in," it said, still using my voice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the corner of the RV, clutching the flashlight, jumping at every sound. When the sun finally rose, I dared to open the door. There were long claw marks running down the side of the RV, and my campsite was in disarray. Chairs knocked over, food scattered everywhere. Jaden's campsite was silent when I went to check on him. His tent was slashed open, and his belongings were strewn about like mine. A dark stain, blood, I realized, marked the ground near the fire pit. I called out for him, but there was no answer. Panic set in. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I needed to leave, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again and again, but it was no use. The thing had done something to it, I was sure of it. As I stood there, trying to figure out what to do, I heard Jaden's voice calling from the woods. "Lila, over here! I need help!" It sounded desperate, terrified. "Jaden?" I called back, my voice trembling. "Where are you?" "Just a little further," his voice replied. I froze. Something about the tone wasn't right. It was too flat, too monotone. And then I remembered what Jaden had said about the Skinwalker mimicking voices. My blood ran cold. "I'm not falling for it," I muttered, backing away from the tree line. That's when I saw it. The thing stepped out from the woods, its body hunched and twisted. It shifted forms right in front of me, going from Jaden to me to something else entirely. Something grotesque, with long, clawed fingers and glowing yellow eyes. It let out a guttural, inhuman screech and started toward me. I ran back into the RV and slammed the door shut just as the creature reached it. It pounded on the sides, the force shaking the whole vehicle. I grabbed a bag of salt from the cupboard. I remembered hearing somewhere that salt could ward off evil spirits, and poured a circle around myself. The pounding stopped. The creature's face appeared at the window, grinning at me with razor-sharp teeth. It snarled, its glowing eyes fixed on mine. "You can't hide forever, Lila," it hissed, its voice a sickening mixture of mine and Jaden's. "I'll see you soon." It disappeared as the first rays of sunlight broke through the trees. I stayed in that circle until I was sure it was gone. When I finally dared to step outside, I saw that the creature had carved something into the hood of the RV. You can't run. I left Potato Creek that morning, abandoning the RV and walking to the nearest ranger station to call for help. They found Jaden's body 2 days later, deep in the woods. His injuries were so horrific that they wouldn't tell me the details. I haven't gone camping since. I don't know if I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whistling outside my window, and I know it's still out there waiting for me. My name is Grace Walker. I'm 42 years old, and this happened last November during a solo RV trip to Morgan Monroe State Forest in Indiana. I'm a travel blogger now, but I used to be an investigative journalist, chasing dangerous stories, exposing corruption, living on the edge. These days, I tell myself I prefer the quiet life. But deep down, I think I was still looking for something. Closure, maybe, or just a story to remind me why I started doing this in the first place. When I drove into Morgan Monroe, I wasn't expecting much, just another forest to hike and photograph, a place to write about for my blog. But when I parked near an old trail called Devil's Watch Path, I found more than I bargained for. The trip started like any other. My RV was parked in a secluded clearing not far from Step Cemetery, a spot known for its eerie reputation. I planned to stay for 3 days, hiking the trails, taking pictures, and maybe digging into some of the local ghost stories for fun. It was cold but clear, and the forest was beautiful. Quiet, serene, alive with the kind of stillness you only find deep in the woods. On my second day, I met a man named Tom Graves. He was about my age, with a salt and pepper beard and a faded green jacket that smelled faintly of campfire smoke. I ran into him near the trailhead as I was setting off for a hike. "Heading up Devil's Watch Path?" he asked. "Thinking about it," I replied, adjusting the strap on my camera. "Why? Something I should know?" Tom hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone, or something, to be there. "They say that trail's cursed," he said. "People get lost. Some don't come back." I gave him a skeptical look. "What, like a ghost story?" "Something like that," he said, his voice low. "Be careful if you go up there." I laughed it off and kept walking. I'd heard plenty of ghost stories in my time, and most of them turned out to be nothing but local legends. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the way Tom had looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. About an hour into the hike, I found the first sign that something was off. The trail was overgrown, almost completely hidden by fallen leaves and underbrush. It was obvious that few people came this way anymore. Then, in a small clearing, I spotted an old campsite, just a ring of blackened stones, a rusty metal cup, and a rotting tarp half buried in the dirt. And on a mossy log near the fire pit, I saw it. A pocket watch. It looked completely out of place, sitting there as if someone had just left it. The metal was untarnished, gleaming silver even in the dim light. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The watch felt cold, heavier than it should have been, and when I opened the lid, the ticking sound was unnervingly loud. That's when I heard the whisper. "Grace." I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The whisper was faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. I spun around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just the wind rustling through the branches. I slipped the watch into my pocket. Why, I couldn't say, and hurried back to my RV. That night, the dreams began. I saw a man standing at the edge of my campsite, tall and shadowy, his eyes glowing a sickly yellow. He held the pocket watch in one hand, his head tilted as if studying me. When I woke up, the whispers were back, threading through the stillness of the night. "Grace, come back." I told myself it was just my imagination. a trick of the mind brought on by Tom's story and the creepy atmosphere of the forest. But the next morning, things got stranger. My camera wouldn't work. Every photo I tried to take was distorted, the images smeared with static and strange streaks of light. My GPS was frozen, the screen locked on a single location even as I moved, and my RV radio, which hadn't worked in years, suddenly came to life, crackling with bursts of static and faint, distorted voices. I should have left then, packed up and driven out of that forest, but something about the watch and the whispers kept pulling me back. I hiked up Devil's Watch Path again that afternoon, hoping to retrace my steps and find some rational explanation for what was happening. The trail felt different this time. The trees seemed closer, their branches knotted together like skeletal hands. The air was heavier, colder, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Then I saw the shadows. They moved between the trees, quick and darting, always just out of focus. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, maybe, but the shapes were wrong. Too tall, too angular, and the whispers were louder now, filling the air with soft, insistent murmurs. At the edge of a clearing, I found Tom waiting for me. "You shouldn't have taken it," he said, his eyes fixed on the pocket watch in my hand. "What is this thing?" I demanded. "What's going on?" Tom hesitated, then sighed. The watch belonged to a man named Daniel Harper. He was a logger, back in the early 1900s. His business was failing, and he made a deal. Some say with the devil, others say with something worse. The watch made him rich for a time, but it drove him mad. One night, he walked into these woods and never came out. "And now, what, the watch is cursed?" Tom nodded. "It binds you to the forest, to him, the Watcher." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. "That's just a story." "Is it?" he said quietly, glancing at the trees. "Do you feel it yet, the pull?" By the time I got back to my RV, the whispers were deafening. They filled every corner of the night, wrapping around me like invisible hands. "Come with me, Grace. You can't escape. You know you want to." I saw the shadows again, circling the campsite, their glowing eyes flickering like candle flames. And then the Watcher appeared. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its form dark and shifting, its eyes fixed on mine. It didn't move, didn't speak, but the weight of its presence was suffocating. I clenched the pocket watch in my hand, the cold metal burning against my skin. "You have to destroy it," Tom had said. "It's the only way." The clearing where I'd found the watch was easy to find. It was as if the forest itself guided me back there. I built a fire in the ring of blackened stones, my hands shaking as I struck the match. The whispers grew louder, angrier, the voices overlapping in a chaotic storm. "Don't do this. You'll regret it. Stay with me." The Watcher appeared again, closer this time, its shadow stretching across the firelight. Its form twisted and writhed, as if the forest itself were alive in its shape. "Leave me alone," I shouted, throwing the pocket watch into the flames. The reaction was immediate. The fire roared to life, brighter and hotter than it should have been. The Watcher let out a guttural, otherworldly scream, its shadow shrinking and distorting until it vanished into the trees. By morning, the forest felt normal again. The air was lighter, the trees no longer pressing in. But the pocket watch was gone, and my camera and GPS worked as if nothing had happened. I left Morgan Monroe that day, shaken but alive. I haven't gone back since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the faint ticking of a watch and wonder if the Watcher is still out there, waiting for someone else to take the deal. My name is Ryan Harris. I'm 29 years old, and I'm a travel nurse, or I was before I took a leave of absence a few months ago. This happened in early November, during a solo trip to Brown County State Park in Indiana. I went there for solitude, hoping to clear my head after a patient I couldn't save pushed me past my limits. What I found in those woods still keeps me awake at night. I'd parked my RV at a secluded campsite near an old, unused hiking trail called Widow's Walk. I'd chosen it on purpose. No other campers nearby, no cell signal, just me, the trees, and time to process everything I'd been carrying. For the first day, it was perfect. I hiked, read a book by the fire, and let the quietness of the forest seep into me. But as the sun dipped below the horizon that first night, the quiet started to feel wrong. It began with whispers, faint and far away, just on the edge of hearing. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound wasn't random. It rose and fell in cadence like speech. My name, Ryan, floated through the air, soft as a breath, and I froze in my chair by the fire. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but gnarled trunks and dry leaves. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was an auditory illusion, my brain filling in gaps in the ambient noise. Stress and exhaustion can do weird things to your perception. That's what I told myself as I climbed into the RV and locked the door. But I didn't sleep well. The whispers returned around 3 a.m., louder this time, as if they were coming from just outside the RV. My name again, mixed with something else I couldn't quite make out. I stuffed earplugs in and lay there, wide-eyed, until morning. The next day, I forced myself to shake off the unease. I was here to reset, and a few creepy noises weren't going to scare me off. My RV's water pump had stopped working, so I decided to hike to a nearby stream to collect water. It was a clear, crisp day, and the forest looked almost cheerful under the sunlight. I followed the narrow dirt path, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots, until I reached the stream. That's where I met Ellie. She was sitting on a rock at the water's edge, her legs dangling over the side. She looked about 11, with pale skin and dark, shoulder-length hair that framed her face like curtains. Her clothes were odd, a faded dress that looked like something out of an old photograph, paired with scuffed leather shoes. "Hey there," I called, unsure what else to say. "Are you lost?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head and stared at me with unnerving calm, like she was sizing me up. Then she smiled faintly. "Not really," she said. "I've been waiting." I frowned. Waiting for what? "For you." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "Where are your parents? Are they camping nearby?" She shook her head, swinging her legs idly. "I don't have parents, not anymore." Something about the way she said it sent a chill down my spine. I glanced around, looking for any sign of other campers or a car, but the woods were silent except for the murmur of the stream. "You shouldn't be out here alone," I said. "It's not safe. I can help you find—" "You can't help me," she interrupted. "But I can help you." That stopped me short. "What are you talking about?" Her eyes, dark and solemn, locked onto mine. "You hear them, don't you? The whispers." The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. "How do you know about that?" She hopped off the rock and walked toward me, her steps soundless on the forest floor. "It's not the forest," she said softly. "It's him, the whisperer. He knows you're here." I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe it was the calm certainty in her voice, or the way she seemed so out of place, like she didn't quite belong to this time or this world. Either way, I listened as she told me about the whisperer. "It's not just a ghost," she explained. "It's worse. It feeds on people, on their sadness, their guilt. It whispers things to make you follow it. and once you do, you're gone." "Gone?" I echoed, my mouth dry. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, a small, almost childlike gesture. "It takes you into the woods. No one ever comes back." I wanted to laugh, to tell her this was ridiculous, but the words died in my throat. Those whispers the night before, they hadn't felt random. They'd felt like they were pulling at something deep inside me, something I didn't want to face. "I don't believe in ghosts," I muttered, more to myself than to her. "You will," she said simply. Ellie followed me back to the RV, saying she had nowhere else to go. I let her, partly because I didn't want to leave her alone in the woods, and partly because I didn't want to be alone myself. She sat silently in the passenger seat as I checked the water tank and gathered wood for the fire. She didn't seem cold or hungry, but her presence was unsettling. That night, the whispers came again. Louder. Closer. This time, they didn't just say my name. They spoke in fragments of sentences, soft and insistent. "You could have saved him." "It's your fault. Come with me." I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. Ellie was sitting at the table, staring out the window. I don't know how long she'd been there. "It's starting," she said without looking at me. "What's starting?" My voice came out hoarse. She turned to me, her expression solemn. "He's trying to break you." The next day, I hiked to Widow's Walk, hoping to clear my head. Ellie stayed behind, saying she couldn't go any further than the RV. Her words stuck with me as I climbed the narrow, twisting path. At first, it felt good to be moving, to be doing something other than sitting and waiting. But as I walked, the forest began to change. The trail I'd followed earlier now seemed unfamiliar. Trees I didn't recognize loomed overhead, their branches twisted into unnatural shapes. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and then I saw them. Objects scattered along the trail, half buried in the dirt. A single leather shoe, a child's doll, its face cracked and stained, rusted tools, fragments of lives abandoned in the woods. I turned back, but the trail had disappeared. Panic surged in my chest as I realized I was lost. That's when I heard it again. The whisperer's voice. "Ryan, you know why you're here." The voice wasn't faint this time. It was clear and intimate, like someone speaking directly into my ear. And it wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and twisting together, all saying the same thing. "Come with me." When I finally stumbled back to the RV, Ellie was waiting for me. She didn't seem surprised when I told her what had happened. "The Whisperer doesn't need to chase you," she said. "He lets the forest do that. The harder you try to escape, the closer you get to him." "Why are you still here?" I demanded. "If you know all this, why haven't you left?" She looked down at her hands. "I can't. He already has me." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "I've been here for a long time," she said quietly. "I don't remember how long, but I can't leave. I'm part of this now." That night, the Whisperer came for me. I woke to the sound of scratching at the RV door, soft at first but growing louder. Shadows moved outside the windows, impossibly tall and angular, their shapes flickering like candle flames. Then the whispers began, filling the air until they were all I could hear. "Come with me, Ryan. You'll find peace. You don't have to feel this way anymore. Follow me." The door handle rattled, and I grabbed the first thing I could find, a flashlight, and yanked it open. There was nothing there, just the empty forest. But when I turned back, Ellie was gone. I don't know what possessed me to follow the whispers, but I did. Maybe I thought I could find Ellie. Maybe the Whisperer had already sunk its claws into my mind. Either way, I found myself stumbling through the dark forest, the whispers guiding me toward a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a massive, gnarled tree, its roots clawing at the earth like skeletal hands. Beneath it stood a figure, shrouded in shadow. Its form shifted constantly, flickering between human and inhuman, its eyes glowing red. "You can't save them," the whisperer said, its voice deep and resonant. "But you can join them." I felt the pull, the promise of release from my guilt, my pain. For a moment, I almost gave in. But then I heard Ellie's voice, distant but clear. "Don't listen." I don't know how I found the strength to resist, but I did. I stumbled backward, turning and running as fast as I could. The whispers grew louder, angrier. But I kept going until I saw the faint glow of the RV in the distance. By morning, Ellie was gone for good. I packed up and left Brown County, my heart heavy with the memory of her and the things I'd seen. The forest had let me go, but I knew it still held others in its grasp. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear faint whispers in the wind, and I wonder if Ellie is still there, waiting for someone else to listen. My name is Jack Turner, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in October, just as the last of the leaves began to turn, at a place called Shades State Park in Indiana. I was there alone, or at least I thought I was. By the end of it, I'd questioned whether solitude in the woods was ever a possibility. I'd parked my RV in a remote campsite near Devil's Hollow, a spot I'd chosen deliberately because it was off the beaten path. My plan was simple: spend a week disconnected from the chaos of life, testing my survival skills and brainstorming ideas for a book I'd been putting off. Writing was supposed to be my calling, but every blank page felt like a wall I couldn't scale. Maybe the forest could help me find my voice. The first day passed quietly. I set up camp, checked my gear, and explored some nearby trails. The quiet felt good, refreshing. That night, I slept like a rock, the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves lulling me into the kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. But by the second night, that peace was gone. It started with my GPS acting up. I'd brought it as a backup to my compass, but when I turned it on, the screen was blank, despite being fully charged. The compass wasn't any better. The needle spun lazily, like it had lost all sense of direction. I chalked it up to a magnetic anomaly, something about the sandstone in the area maybe, but it made me uneasy, so I stayed close to the RV. Around dusk, I heard footsteps on the gravel road nearby. I thought I was alone in this part of the park, but maybe another camper had wandered in. When I stepped out to investigate, I saw her. A young woman, maybe early 20s, wearing a heavy backpack and a bright yellow beanie. She spotted me and waved, her grin wide and easy. "Hey! Sorry if I'm intruding," she said, walking toward me. I got turned around. "Mind if I camp here for the night?" Her name was Chloe Baxter, and she was a college student researching local folklore for a project. She'd come to Shade State Park to investigate stories about Devil's Hollow, specifically the legend of skinwalkers. According to her, the hollow was a hot spot for strange disappearances and sightings of something that wasn't quite human. "Skinwalkers?" I asked, skeptical. "You mean like Navajo legends? That's not exactly native to Indiana." "Folklore adapts," she said, shrugging. "People in these parts say there's something out here that mimics voices, maybe even faces. Creepy, right?" I wasn't thrilled about the company. I'd come out here to be alone, after all. But she seemed harmless enough, and night was falling. I let her set up a tent near the RV, figuring she'd be gone by morning. That night, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was Chloe talking in her sleep. But the more I listened, the more I realized the voice wasn't coming from her tent. It was outside, in the woods. "Jack!" The whisper was soft, almost playful, but it froze me in place. How did this person know my name? I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cold, heavy, and dead silent. No crickets, no wind, just my own shallow breathing. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. But then, just as I turned back toward the RV, I saw movement. A figure, tall, lanky, and hunched, slipped between the trees, its shape barely visible in the dim light. It moved unnaturally, its limbs jerking like a puppet on strings. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, Chloe was full of energy, oblivious to my unease. She wanted to explore the hollow, claiming she'd found an old map that marked sacred grounds used by local tribes. I told her it was a bad idea, but she just laughed. "Come on, don't you want a good story for that book of yours?" she teased. Against my better judgment, I went with her. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me didn't want to be alone anymore. The hike to Devil's Hollow was rougher than I'd expected. The trail was overgrown, and the deeper we went, the more oppressive the forest felt. Chloe didn't seem to notice. She was too busy snapping photos and rambling about Skinwalker lore. "This place is supposed to mess with your head," she said, grinning. "People say they hear voices, see things that aren't really there. It's like the forest is alive." "Great," I muttered. "Just what I need." About an hour in, we found something strange. A cluster of animal bones arranged in a spiral pattern on the forest floor. The bones were old, bleached white by the sun, but the arrangement was deliberate, almost ritualistic. "Okay, that's weird," Chloe admitted, kneeling to take a closer look. "You think someone did this?" "Or something," I said, my unease growing. The further we went, the stranger things became. We found claw marks on trees, deep, jagged grooves that no bear or cougar could have made. Then there were the tracks, large, hoof-like prints that appeared in the soft dirt, but disappeared after just a few steps. By the time we reached the hollow, I was ready to turn back. But Chloe insisted on pressing on, her curiosity outweighing her common sense. She led me to a large oak tree at the edge of the ravine. Carved into the bark were strange symbols, crude, geometric shapes that radiated an almost palpable sense of dread. "Do you feel that?" Chloe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. The air around the tree was heavy, electric, like the buildup before a thunderstorm. I didn't want to be there anymore. The first attack came as we were heading back to camp. It was just before sunset, and the shadows were long and shifting. Chloe was ahead of me on the trail when she stopped suddenly. "Did you hear that?" she asked. I didn't hear anything, but then a voice echoed through the trees. It was faint, but unmistakable. Someone calling Chloe's name. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The voice didn't answer. Instead, it laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent chills down my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure from the night before. It stood motionless at the edge of the trail, its body obscured by the trees, but its face was Chloe's. We ran. I didn't care where we were going, I just wanted to get away. By the time we made it back to the RV, the sun had set, and the forest was pitch black. Chloe was shaken, her bravado gone. "What was that?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "A skinwalker," I said, surprising myself with how easily the word came out. "Or whatever this place has instead." We locked ourselves in the RV, but the night was far from over. The creature didn't give up. It circled the campsite, its footsteps crunching on the gravel, its shadow flickering in the firelight. At one point, it knocked on the door, mimicking my voice. "Let me in," it said, its tone eerily calm. "It's not safe out here." The journal saved us. Chloe found it tucked in a drawer in the RV, a worn leather book filled with shaky handwriting. It belonged to a hunter who'd camped in the area decades ago. His entries described encounters with the same creature, its mimicry, its stalking, its hatred of light and fire. The final entry mentioned a sacred circle marked by stones, where he'd performed a ritual to banish it. Armed with this knowledge, we made a plan. At dawn, we'd head to the circle and try the ritual ourselves. But the Skinwalker wasn't going to make it easy. The attack came just before sunrise. The creature tore at the RV, its claws screeching against the metal. Chloe screamed as the windows shattered, shards of glass raining down on us. I grabbed the hunter's journal and a flashlight, the only weapon I had. We ran again, this time toward the sacred circle. The forest seemed to close in around us, the branches clawing at our clothes, the shadows shifting with every step. The creature was right behind us, its guttural growls growing louder. When we reached the circle, I barely had time to catch my breath before it appeared, stepping into the clearing. In the pale light of dawn, I saw it clearly for the first time. Its elongated limbs, its skin stretched tight over bones, its face a grotesque parody of Chloe's. I held up the flashlight, and it recoiled, hissing like a feral animal. Chloe began reciting the ritual from the journal, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The creature lunged at her, but I stepped between them, slashing at it with a hunting knife I'd grabbed from the RV. The blade cut deep, and the creature howled, a sound that echoed through the hollow. With one final cry, Chloe finished the ritual. The creature let out a bone-chilling scream before collapsing into the dirt, its body disintegrating into ash. We survived, but just barely. The RV was destroyed, and we had to hike back to the park entrance, battered and bruised but alive. Chloe said she'd never step foot in a forest again. I didn't blame her. As for me, I'm still not sure what I believe. But one thing's certain, the woods are not as empty as they seem. Sometimes they watch. My name is Kate Anderson, and I'm 41 years old. This happened last October, during one of the lowest points in my life. I just lost my husband, Michael, to a sudden heart attack. Writing was my only solace, so I decided to take my RV and set out on the road, researching stories of folklore and urban legends for my next book. I thought immersing myself in old tales would help me escape my grief. Instead, it brought me face to face with something I can't explain, something that nearly destroyed me. It started with Devil's Hollow Road, a stretch of pavement just outside Fort Wayne, Indiana, surrounded by dense woods and steeped in chilling stories about witches and the devil himself. I'd come across the name while researching local legends and knew I had to see it for myself. I wish I hadn't. The trip began uneventfully. I parked my RV in a clearing near the edge of the road, a little farther from the main campground than I probably should have. I wanted privacy to write and think, and the spot was perfect, quiet, secluded, surrounded by towering trees that glowed gold and orange in the autumn sun. The first sign that something wasn't right came at a gas station just outside the area. The attendant, a grizzled man with a thick beard and tired eyes, gave me a strange look when I mentioned where I was headed. "Devil's Hollow, huh?" he said, leaning on the counter. "You doing one of those ghost hunting shows?" "No, I'm a writer. I'm working on a book about local legends." He snorted. "Well, you've picked the right place. Folks around here say that road's cursed. They say people see lights in the woods, hear voices that ain't there. Some folks go up there and never come back." I forced a smile. Sounds like a story waiting to be told. "Just don't go looking for trouble," he said, his tone suddenly serious. The stories might be more than just stories. I arrived at my campsite in the late afternoon. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the RV. It was beautiful, but unnervingly still. That night, as I sat at my laptop trying to write, I heard a scratching noise outside. It started faint, like twigs brushing against the side of the RV, but grew louder, more deliberate. "Probably just a raccoon," I muttered to myself, grabbing a flashlight. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp and cold. I shone the light around the RV, half expecting to see an animal scurrying away. Instead, I found long, deep scratches on the side of the vehicle. 3 parallel lines that stretched nearly from top to bottom. My stomach churned. No raccoon had claws that big. I retreated inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. Devil's Hollow was eerie even in daylight. The trees grew thick and close, their twisted branches forming almost a canopy overhead. The road itself was cracked and uneven, as if the earth beneath it had shifted. About a mile from my campsite, I found it. A burned patch of ground with a strange symbol scorched into the dirt. It was a pentagram, surrounded by intricate runes I didn't recognize. I crouched down, running my fingers over the charred edges. The air around the marking felt colder, as if the ground itself were leaching away heat. My breath fogged in the air, even though the day wasn't particularly cold. I pulled out my phone to take a photo, but the screen glitched, static lines distorting the image. "Great," I muttered, slipping the phone back into my pocket. As I stood, I felt a prickle of unease, like I was being watched. I spun around, but there was no one there. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The scratches on the RV, the burned symbol, the glitching phone, it all felt connected, though I couldn't explain how. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the fire trying to focus on my notebook. The air grew colder, and the shadows around me deepened, stretching like grasping fingers. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, locking onto mine. I froze, my pen slipping from my hand. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just watched. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but the figure was gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV felt stifling, the air heavy with unease. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Then the whispers started. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But soon, they grew clearer, more insistent. "Kate." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. "Kate!" It was my husband's voice. I stumbled to the window, peering out into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw him, Michael, standing just beyond the trees. But when I blinked, he was gone. The next day, desperate for answers, I returned to the burned marking. The air felt even colder than before, and the forest was deathly silent. This time, I found more. Scattered around the pentagram were blackened candles, animal bones, and dark stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. As I stared at the remnants of the ritual, the whispers started again, louder this time. "Come to us!" The wind picked up, swirling leaves around me. I turned to run, but my foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling to the ground. When I looked up, the shadowy figure was there, standing over me. Its face was featureless, a void of darkness. Its glowing eyes bore into mine, filling me with a suffocating sense of dread. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to the RV, my breath hitching in my throat. That night, he came for me. The RV's lights flickered, plunging me into darkness. The temperature plummeted, frost forming on the windows. And then he was inside. I don't know how he got in. I didn't hear the door open, but when I turned, he was there. The silent man. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, his presence filling the small space like a black hole. "Why are you doing this?" I choked out. He tilted his head, his glowing eyes narrowing. Then the RV shifted, the walls groaning as if under immense pressure. Suddenly, the silent man raised a hand, and the world around me changed. I was no longer in the RV, I was in my living room, the scent of Michael's cologne filling the air. He stood in front of me, smiling, his arms open wide. "Kate," he said softly, "it's okay, you can let go now. You can stay here with me." Tears blurred my vision. "Michael, But then his face twisted, his smile stretching too wide, his skin cracked, revealing the same dark void I'd seen in the silent man. "No!" I screamed, yanking myself away from the illusion. Back in the RV, the silent man advanced on me, his presence suffocating. Desperate, I grabbed a can of camping fuel and splashed it across the floor. My hands shook as I struck a match, the tiny flame dancing in the darkness. "This ends now," I said, my voice trembling. I dropped the match. The fire roared to life, filling the RV with heat and light. The silent man recoiled, his shadowy form writhing as the flames consumed him. I stumbled out into the cold night, watching as the RV burned, the whispers fading into silence. I never went back to Devil's Hollow. I lost almost everything in the fire, my laptop, my notes, my equipment, but I survived. Now, as I write this, I still wonder if it was all real. If the silent man was a figment of my grief or something darker. But sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers outside my window, and I wonder if he's waiting for me to return. My name is Ryan Carter, and I'm 32 years old. This happened last October, during a solo trip to Clifty Falls State Park in southern Indiana. I went there to clear my head, maybe even find some peace after a rough divorce. I'm a photographer, always searching for the perfect shot, and I thought the park's famous waterfalls and gorges would provide the kind of distraction I needed. Instead, I found something I can't explain. Something I wish I could forget. I rented an old RV for the trip. It wasn't much, a creaky, faded box with a sputtering generator, but it suited my needs. I parked it at a campsite near Tunnel Falls, far from the main campground. I wanted solitude, and I got it, too much of it. I arrived at the park in the late afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the winding trails and dense forest. I stopped by the visitor center to grab a map, where I met Kevin, the park ranger. He was a tall guy in his 40s with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You camping near Tunnel Falls?" he asked as he handed me the map. "Yeah, I figured it'd be quiet out there." He gave me a strange look, like he wanted to say something but thought better of it. Finally, he said, "Just be careful near the gorges. Trails can be tricky, especially if you're hiking alone." "Thanks, I'll be careful," I said, folding the map and heading out. I wasn't worried. I'd been hiking and photographing wilderness for years. I knew how to handle myself. But as I left, I could feel his eyes on me, like he was watching a man walking toward a trap. After setting up the RV, I grabbed my camera and headed out to explore. The trails were beautiful, winding through vibrant autumn foliage, the air crisp and cool. I felt a sense of peace for the first time in months. That was, until I heard it. At first it sounded like singing, faint and melodic, drifting through the trees. I froze, listening, but it stopped. I shook my head and kept walking, telling myself it was just my imagination. But a few minutes later I heard it again, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the trees. No response, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I kept walking, my unease growing. Then I saw her. She was standing near the edge of the gorge, her back to me. A young woman, barefoot, wearing a dress that looked like it belonged in a century-old photograph. Her hair was long and damp, clinging to her back like she'd just stepped out of the water. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't move. "Do you need help?" I tried again, stepping closer. That's when she turned to look at me. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She didn't say a word, just stared at me for a moment before stepping into the mist and vanishing. I ran to the spot where she'd been standing, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of her at all. Back at the RV, I tried to shake off the encounter. I told myself she must have been another hiker, though I couldn't explain how she disappeared so quickly. I reviewed the photos I'd taken that day, hoping they'd distract me. But when I scrolled through the images, my stomach dropped. In several of the shots, there was something wrong with the mist near the gorge. It looked distorted, like faces were forming in the fog. One of them was unmistakably the woman I'd seen, her hollow eyes staring back at me through the screen. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking. That night, the RV felt colder than it should have. I double-checked the heater, but it seemed to be working fine. Still, I couldn't shake the chill. As I lay in bed, I heard it again. Faint singing, drifting through the night. I tried to tell myself it was the wind, but it didn't sound like the wind. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, like someone tapping on the RV's door. I froze, holding my breath. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. "Who's there?" I called out, grabbing a flashlight. No answer. I opened the door, shining the light into the darkness. No one was there. But on the ground, just outside the RV, I saw wet footprints leading away toward the gorge. The next day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it all. Maybe the stress of the divorce was messing with my head. I headed out again, determined to focus on my photography. But as I neared Big Clifty Falls, I saw her again. She was standing in the water this time, just below the falls. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her thin frame. She looked up at me, her dark eyes meeting mine. "Please," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "I'm lost. Can you help me?" I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay away, but I couldn't just leave her there. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and began walking, motioning for me to follow. I hesitated, but eventually followed her off the trail, deeper into the woods. She led me to the edge of another gorge, then stopped. "This is where it happened," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What happened?" She turned to face me, her expression twisted with grief and anger. "They left us here. They left us to die." Before I could respond, she vanished again, leaving me alone near the edge. That night, the RV became a prison. The whispers started just after sunset, faint at first but growing louder. They seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. "Ryan," they whispered, "come to us." The pounding started again, this time on every wall of the RV. I grabbed my camera, desperate to document whatever was happening, but when I tried to take a photo, the camera refused to work. Through the window, I saw shadows moving in the trees. Shapes that looked human but weren't. Desperate for answers, I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the gorge. The whispers guided me, growing louder the closer I got. At the edge, I saw them. Figures climbing the cliffs, their bodies twisted and broken. Among them was Claire, her face pale and wet. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded. Her expression softened, and for a moment I saw the sadness beneath the rage. "We were abandoned," she said. "They left us here to starve, and now we are not alone." The shadows surged toward me, their hands clawing at my arms and legs. They tried to drag me toward the edge, their strength overwhelming. In a last-ditch effort, I swung the flashlight wildly, the beam of light scattering the figures. Claire screamed, her voice echoing through the gorge. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran back to the RV, my heart pounding, and drove out of the park without looking back. I never returned to Clifty Falls. I sold my camera equipment, unable to look at another photo without thinking of those faces in the mist. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, soft, faint, and calling my name. My name is Grace Walker, and I'm 26 years old. This happened in October of last year, when my best friend Sophia and I decided to spend a weekend camping at Dogwood Lake, deep in the heart of southern Indiana. I'll never forget those days, no matter how hard I try. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the laughter. Sophia and I couldn't have been more different. She was bold, impulsive, and always looking for her next adventure. I, on the other hand, preferred plans, structure, and knowing exactly what I was walking into. But she had a way of pulling me out of my comfort zone, and I usually ended up having a good time. Usually. We'd rented an old RV for the trip, a boxy, white thing with a sputtering engine that smelled faintly of mildew. I'd suggested staying in a cabin, but Sophia insisted the RV would be more authentic. After some back and forth, I gave in, as I always did. Besides, I was desperate for a break. My teaching job had been wearing me down, and Sophia's promise of crisp autumn air, hiking trails, and kayaking sounded like the reset I needed. We arrived at Dogwood Recreation Area in the late afternoon, just as the sun was dipping below the treetops. The forest was alive with color, fiery reds, deep oranges, and golden yellows that reflected off the still surface of the lake. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt off. I chalked it up to exhaustion and a touch of nerves. Sophia, of course, was thrilled. She grabbed her camera and started snapping photos the moment we parked. "Look at this light," she gushed. "It's perfect." I rolled my eyes but couldn't help smiling. That was Sophia, always chasing the perfect shot. After setting up camp, we decided to explore. There was a well-marked trailhead nearby, but Sophia had other ideas. She'd spotted a faint path leading off into the woods, one that wasn't on the map. "Let's check it out," she said, already heading in that direction. "Are you serious? It's getting dark," I protested. "That's the best time for photos," she called over her shoulder. "Come on, Grace, don't be such a buzzkill." Reluctantly, I followed. The trail, if you could call it that, was narrow and overgrown, twisting through dense trees that blocked out what little sunlight remained. I kept tripping over roots and brushing cobwebs from my face, muttering under my breath about poison ivy and ticks. Sophia, meanwhile, was in her element, snapping pictures of moss-covered rocks and fallen leaves. Then she found it. At first, I thought it was just a piece of trash, something shiny poking out of the dirt. But when Sophia bent down and picked it up, I realized it was a locket. An old one, tarnished and rusted, but still intact. She turned it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up with curiosity. "Can you believe this? It's so vintage." "It's gross," I said. "Put it back." But she ignored me, rubbing the locket clean on her sleeve. "It's got initials engraved on it. AM. Wonder who it belonged to." "Does it matter? It's trash." She shot me a look. It's not trash, it's history. Then she slipped the locket into her pocket. I'm keeping it. I didn't argue. What was the point? Sophia was stubborn, and once she'd made up her mind about something, there was no changing it. That night, things started to feel strange. The heater in the RV wouldn't work, so we huddled under blankets, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something was out there, watching us. But when I mentioned it to Sophia, she laughed it off. "You're just spooked because it's so quiet out here," she said. "City girl problems." Maybe she was right. I told myself I was imagining things and eventually drifted off to sleep. Then the dreams started. I was standing by the lake, staring at the water. A woman stood on the shore, her back to me. Her hair was long and dark, and she wore a dress that clung to her as if it were soaked. She was holding something, a locket, I realized. Her shoulders shook as though she were crying, but no sound came out. When she turned around, her face was a mask of rage, her eyes hollow and black. She opened her mouth to scream, and I woke up gasping for air. Across the RV, Sophia was sound asleep, the locket clutched in her hand. The next day, Sophia acted normal, but I couldn't shake the dream. I told her about it over breakfast, expecting her to laugh it off again. Instead, she frowned. "That's weird," she said. "I had a dream too, about a woman at the lake. What did she do?" She was just standing there, watching me. She shrugged. It didn't feel scary, though, just sad. I wasn't convinced. Something about the locket wasn't right, but Sophia refused to get rid of it. "It's just a coincidence," she said. "Don't freak out." But as the day went on, the unease grew. Wet footprints appeared on the RV floor, even though neither of us had been near the water. Items went missing, a flashlight, Sophia's phone charger, only to turn up later in odd places. And then there were the voices. That evening, as we sat by the fire, I heard it. The faint sound of children laughing. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but Sophia heard it too. "Probably just echoes from another campsite," she said, though her tone was less certain. "There's no one else out here," I whispered. We stared into the darkness, but the laughter faded as quickly as it had come. That night, I woke to the sound of the RV door creaking open. Sophia's bed was empty. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, my heart pounding. The forest was pitch black, the trees casting long shadows under the sliver of moonlight. I found Sophia standing at the edge of the lake, her feet submerged in the water. She was holding the locket, her lips moving as if she were whispering something, though I couldn't hear the words. "Sophia!" I yelled. She turned slowly, her eyes glazed over. "She wants me to stay," she said, her voice distant and hollow. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back to the RV, but she fought me, her strength unnaturally strong. "Let go! I need to go to her." Finally, I managed to drag her inside and lock the door. She collapsed onto her bed and fell into a deep sleep, but I stayed awake, clutching a knife and listening for the sound of footsteps outside. The next morning, Sophia didn't remember a thing. She laughed it off, but I could see the fear in her eyes. The locket's influence was growing stronger, and I knew we had to leave. But the RV wouldn't start. Sophia tried to call for help, but her phone was dead, even though it had been fully charged the night before. I suggested walking back to the main road, but she refused. "I'm not leaving the RV," she said. "What if someone comes by?" I didn't argue. I couldn't leave her alone, not when she was acting so strange. Instead, I decided to confront the problem head-on. That afternoon, while Sophia was napping, I took the locket and walked to the lake. The air grew colder the closer I got, and the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. I stood at the water's edge, the locket heavy in my hand. "I know you're here," I said. "What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the surface of the lake rippled and the woman appeared. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark pits of sorrow and rage. Behind her, shadowy figures emerged, children with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. "Return it," she hissed. Her voice was like nails on glass. "Return what you stole." I threw the locket into the water and turned to run, but the children's laughter erupted around me, and I felt icy hands grab my ankles. I screamed, kicking and clawing, but the hands dragged me toward the water. Just as I thought I was going to drown, Sophia appeared, her face twisted with fear and determination. She held a stick lit with fire from the RV's stove. "Let her go!" she screamed, thrusting the flame toward the water. The ghostly figures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the air. Sophia grabbed my arm and pulled me back to shore. Together, we watched as the locket sank beneath the surface, the ripples fading into stillness. We left Dogwood Lake the next day, abandoning the RV and hitchhiking back to civilization. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, but I knew we'd both been changed. Sophia never picked up her camera again, and I can't look at a lake without feeling a chill run down my spine. Some nights, I still hear the laughter, soft and distant, like an echo from a nightmare. I pray it's just my imagination, but deep down I know it's not. My name is Riley Marks, and I'm 33 years old. This happened last fall when I traveled to Black Bayou Lake in northern Louisiana. I was there to write an article on the folklore of Louisiana's most haunted places, but the story I uncovered was something I could never put into print. What I found in the bayou was far too personal and far too terrifying to share with anyone until now. I had been traveling in my RV for a few weeks, chasing legends. I'd interviewed locals about haunted plantations, mysterious swamp creatures, and long-forgotten ghost towns. Black Bayou was meant to be the grand finale, the perfect setting to cap off my piece with its shadowy waters, gnarled cypress trees, and the legend of La Dame Sombre. I didn't believe in ghosts, of course. Not really. I thought there might be something to the stories, a flicker of truth twisted into folklore, but nothing supernatural. I was wrong. I arrived at the wildlife refuge late in the afternoon. The golden sunlight filtering through the trees made the bayou look almost peaceful, but there was an underlying silence that unnerved me. No chirping birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my RV tires crunching gravel as I pulled into the visitor center parking lot. A woman stepped out to greet me. She was older, with wiry gray hair tied back in a ponytail and sun-worn skin. Her name tag read Marcy. She gave me a once-over, sizing me up like she'd seen my kind before. "Journalist, huh?" she said as I introduced myself. "Y'all always come poking around here, asking about La Dame." "Is the legend true?" I asked, smiling, trying to put her at ease. She didn't return the smile. "It's true enough. I'll tell you this much. Don't go wandering off after dark. She don't like being disturbed." Before I could press her for more, a man in waders walked past, carrying a fishing pole. He tipped his hat at me and said, "Better listen to her. This place will play tricks on you if you're not careful." I laughed nervously, but neither of them looked like they were joking. That evening, I parked my RV at the designated campsite near the water. I set up my equipment, camera, audio recorder, and notepad, and waited for the sun to set. The bayou transformed at night. The golden light gave way to an eerie, inky darkness. The trees cast long shadows over the still water, and the air felt heavier, damp, and clinging. I started recording notes, speaking softly into my phone. Day 1, Black Bayou Lake. Locals are tight-lipped about La Dame Sombre, but they all seem to believe in her. Legend says she was a woman betrayed by her lover, who lured her into the bayou and left her to drown. Her spirit's been haunting the water ever since, pulling people under if they get too close. I paused, feeling a chill run down my spine. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard humming. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakably human. I turned off the recorder and stepped outside, shining my flashlight toward the water. The beam caught the gnarled roots of a cypress tree and nothing else. The humming stopped. The next day, I met a man named Cole at the visitor center. He was loading a small boat onto his truck, his face tanned from years spent on the water. "You the one asking about La Dame?" he asked, spitting into the dirt. I nodded, and he chuckled darkly. "You don't look like the type to believe in ghosts." "I don't," I said. "I'm just writing a story." "Well, here's a story for you." He leaned against his truck, his expression growing serious. "A buddy of mine went out fishing one night, chasing lights he saw on the water. Never came back. We found his boat the next morning, stuck in the reeds. No sign of him, but his pole was still in the water like he'd just stepped away for a second." "What kind of lights?" I asked. "Lanterns, maybe, or something like that. Could have been La Dame luring him in. That's what the old folks say she does. Calls you out there with her singing or her lights, and once you follow her, you're done for." That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of the bayou pressed against my ears like a weight. The faint humming I'd heard the night before had been easy enough to brush off as my imagination. But Cole's story had settled into my mind, churning like the water below. Around midnight, I heard it again, the humming. This time it was closer, louder, and undeniably real. My heart pounded as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off the water's surface. At first, I saw nothing. Then, in the distance, a flickering light appeared. It was faint, like the glow of an old oil lantern. I should have gone back inside. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to lock the doors, and wait for morning. But something, curiosity, guilt, or maybe sheer stupidity, pushed me forward. I grabbed my boots and a jacket and followed the light. The trail wound through the trees, twisting and turning until I lost sight of my RV entirely. The lantern light bobbed ahead of me, always just out of reach. I called out once, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. The only response was the soft splash of water as I stepped onto the edge of the bayou. That's when I heard it. A voice. Soft, melodic, and heartbreakingly familiar. "Riley?" I froze. It couldn't be. The voice was faint but unmistakable. Eli, my younger sibling. They'd been missing for nearly 20 years, lost on a camping trip when I was supposed to be watching them. The memory of that day had haunted me ever since, and hearing their voice now sent a chill down my spine. "Eli?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is that you?" The lantern light flickered, and a shadowy figure appeared on the water. It was hard to make out, but the shape was human, standing impossibly still on the surface of the bayou. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I took a step closer, then another. "Come closer," the voice whispered. "Help me." I was waist-deep in the water before I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving. Its outline shimmered and wavered like smoke, and its eyes, dark, empty hollows, locked onto mine. The humming started again, louder this time, vibrating through my chest. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but the water around me began to ripple. Shadowy shapes darted beneath the surface, circling me like predators. I stumbled, falling to my knees, and that's when I saw her. La Dame Sombre rose from the water, her figure impossibly tall and gaunt. Her skin was pale and slick, her hair hanging in wet, tangled strands over her face. Her eyes glowed faintly, and her mouth curved into a jagged, unnatural smile. "You came for them," she said, her voice like a hiss, "but they are not here." I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Her hand reached for me, long and skeletal, dripping with black water. My mind raced, searching for something, anything that could save me. Then I remembered Marcy's warning. I fumbled in my pocket and found the small silver charm she'd given me earlier that day. "For luck," she'd said, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. I held it up, my hand trembling, and the ghost let out an ear-piercing scream. The water around me churned violently, and the shadowy shapes vanished. Dame Sombre recoiled, her form flickering like a dying flame. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the safety of my RV. I left Black Bayou the next morning, my hands still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. The charm sat on the dashboard, its surface tarnished and warm to the touch. I didn't look back as I drove away, but the haunting melody of her humming stayed with me. Even now, I hear it sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. I'll wake up drenched in sweat, convinced she's outside my window waiting. And maybe she is. Maybe La Dame Sombre never really lets you go. But there's one thing I know for certain. I won't be writing that article. Some stories are better left untold.